The city of San Mora never truly slept. Even at 2 in the morning, when most of the windows in the tall buildings had gone dark and the last of the restaurants had flipped their signs from open to closed, the city still breathed. It still hummed. Its streets were still wet from an earlier rain, and the yellow light from the street lamps bounced off the puddles on the sidewalk like broken pieces of gold scattered across the ground. Delivery trucks rumbled past empty intersections. Stray cats moved in the shadows between dumpsters. A dog barked somewhere far away and then went quiet. The city was alive the way a sleeping giant is alive, slow and deep and full of something powerful just underneath the surface. Marco Reyes sat in the back seat of his black car, with his elbow resting on the door and his jaw set like concrete. He was not looking at his phone. He was not talking. He was staring out the window at the wet streets moving past him. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had seen too much of the world and found very little of it worth smiling about. He was 34 years old, and he looked both younger and much, much older than that at the same time. His hair was dark, and his eyes were darker, and he had a scar that ran along his left jawline that he never explained to anyone, and no one was brave enough to ask about. He wore an expensive black coat, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month, and his hands, resting in his lap, were completely still. Not the still of a calm man. The still of a man who had learned a very long time ago that stillness looked like power, and power was the only language his world truly understood. His driver, a large quiet man everyone called Big Paolo, knew better than to speak unless spoken to. He had worked for Marco Reyes for 11 years. He had driven him through celebrations and through disasters. He had driven him away from hospitals and toward warehouses at 3 in the morning. He knew that Marco, after a late meeting, was like a sky after a storm. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and slippery, and you had to watch every single step. So Big Paolo drove, and the city moved past them both, and the silence in the car was thick and steady. They had just come from a meeting that had lasted 4 hours longer than it was supposed to. Marco had sat across a long table from 3 men who ran territory on the south side of San Mora. Men who thought that because Marco had been quieter recently, because he had pulled back from certain operations, because he had been spending more time handling things through lawyers and paperwork instead of the old ways, they thought that meant he was getting soft. They had come to that meeting with smug faces and crossed arms, and had tried to renegotiate things that had already been agreed upon. They had tried to take more than what was theirs. They had not succeeded. By the time Marco stood up to leave, all 3 men were very sorry they had tried, and none of them were smiling anymore. Marco had not raised his voice. He had not slammed a fist on the table. He had simply spoken, low and precise and absolutely certain. And somehow that was worse than anything louder would have been. He had that gift, the gift of making people feel the weight of his words before the words even finished landing. And it was a gift that had kept him alive and at the top for a very long time. But gifts like that have a price. And the price Marco Reyes paid was that he had become so good at being hard that he had almost forgotten there was any other way to be. He had locked every soft thing inside himself behind a door so heavy that even he had stopped trying to open it. His mother had died 2 years ago, and he had buried his grief so deep it had turned into stone inside his chest. His last relationship, with a woman named Carol Vega, had ended badly, which meant it had ended the way most things in his world ended, with betrayal and silence and a coldness that settled over everything like frost. He had decided after Carol that people were not safe things to want. That wanted people gave him a map to the places inside you that could be hurt. And Marco Reyes could not afford to be hurt. He was the kind of man whose enemies watched his face for any flicker of weakness, and so he had made sure his face showed none. He was thinking about none of this consciously as the car rolled through the quiet streets of Samora. He was just looking out the window, just watching the city breathe. And then he saw her. She was standing beside a large metal trash can outside a pharmacy that had closed 3 hours earlier. The pharmacy's lights were off, and the gate was halfway pulled down over the glass door, and the street around it was completely empty except for her. She was young, maybe 26, 27, and she was wearing a thin jacket that was soaking wet from the earlier rain. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and water was dripping from the end of her ponytail. She was not crying. She was not panicking. She was standing there very deliberately, bent slightly forward, reaching into the trash can beside the pharmacy door and pulling out old medicine boxes one at a time, reading the labels carefully, squinting under the weak yellow light of the nearest street lamp, then setting each one aside and reaching for the next. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from cold. Marco said 2 words. Just 2. He said, "Stop the car." Big Paolo stopped the car. The 3 bodyguards in the follow vehicle behind them were out of their doors before Marco had even fully stepped out of his. They moved fast and quiet, hands disappearing inside their jackets, eyes scanning the empty street in every direction. Marco raised one hand without turning around, a single flat gesture, and all 3 men stopped exactly where they were. He walked forward alone across the wet pavement, his footsteps quiet, his coat hanging open in the night air. He stopped a few feet away from the girl and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He had spent years learning how to read a situation in the first 3 seconds. He looked at her hands, no weapon, just cardboard. He looked at her feet, cheap sneakers soaked through. He looked at her face, focused, not unhinged, not dangerous, just desperately searching for something in a pile of other people's discarded things. "What are you looking for?" he asked. She spun around so fast, she nearly knocked the trash can over. She stumbled back 1 step and pressed a hand flat against the pharmacy gate behind her, steadying herself. And then she looked at him, really looked at him, and for one moment her face showed pure surprise. Then the surprise folded itself up very quickly, like a piece of paper being tucked into a pocket, and what replaced it was something that Marco did not expect at all from a girl standing soaking wet in an alley at 2 in the morning. What replaced it was dignity. Chin up, eyes steady, shoulders back despite the wet jacket and the shaking hands. "None of your business," she said. Marco looked at the box in her hand. He had eyes that missed nothing and a memory that forgot nothing, and he read the label in under 2 seconds. Rosalind, pediatric heart medication, suitable for children ages 4 to 12. He knew the name. He knew the price. $900 a bottle, sometimes more depending on the pharmacy. His own mother had been prescribed a related medication in the last years of her life, and the sight of that name on a wet cardboard box pulled at something in the bottom of his chest that he had not felt pull in a very long time. "Who is it for?" he asked again, and his voice was still low and still serious, but something in the texture of it had changed, something barely noticeable. The girl's chin stayed up, but her eyes changed. They did not fill the way some people's eyes fill, dramatically performing the emotion for whoever was watching. They changed the way deep water changes when something breaks the surface, a ripple, small and real, moving outward from the center. She pressed her lips together for just a moment. Then she spoke. "My sister. She's 8 years old. The pharmacy won't refill her prescription until I pay off my old account balance. I've been working on it, but I'm not there yet, and she ran out 4 days ago, and she stopped, swallowed, started again with the facts, just the facts, because fact were safer. I thought maybe there was a half-used bottle that someone threw away. I know how that sounds. I know it's crazy. I know." She turned away from him when she said the last part. Turned away from him and looked down at the box in her hand and the pile of empty boxes beside the trash can. And there was something in that turning away that was worse than tears would have been. It was the movement of someone who had grown so used to disappointing endings that she had already started preparing for this one, already started wrapping her own sadness around herself before anyone had the chance to make it worse. Marco stood on the wet pavement in the dark city and felt something happen in the locked room inside his chest. It was small. It was almost nothing. It was the sound, if feelings could make sounds, of one single crack in a very thick wall. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He made one call. He said 4 words. Fill the Santos account. He listened for 3 seconds, said nothing else, and put the phone away. Then he did something he had not done for another person in a very long time. He took off his coat, his expensive, perfectly tailored black coat, and he stepped forward and placed it around the girl's wet shoulders. She looked at him like he had started speaking a language she did not know. Go to Mercy Pharmacy on 5th Street, he said. Tell them your name. It will be ready. Go tonight before the night shift changes at 4. The girl stood perfectly still. The coat was enormously big on her. The shoulders dropped nearly to her elbows, but she did not take it off. She stood there in the streetlight and looked at him with an expression that was cycling through things too fast to name. Disbelief, confusion, a careful, cautious thing that was not yet hope, but was standing right next to it. And underneath all of that, something sharper, the particular look of a person who has learned to be suspicious of things that seem too good, because things that seem too good have always had a catch. Who are you? She asked. Marco looked at her for a moment. A real moment, longer than he normally gave anyone. Nobody you want to know, he said. And then he walked back to his car. Big Paolo said nothing for 4 full minutes as they drove away. Then, very quietly, without taking his eyes off the road, he said, "That was a good thing, boss." Marco said nothing. He looked out the window, but his jaw was not quite as set as it had been before. What Lily Santos did not know, could not possibly know, was that Marco had seen her face before that night. 6 months earlier, there had been a banquet at the Grand Meridian Hotel on the north side of the city. Marco had been there for a private meeting disguised as a charity dinner, sitting at a corner table, watching a room full of people who smiled at each other with their teeth while meaning something entirely different with their eyes. He had been doing that, watching, cataloging, being invisible in plain sight when the incident happened. A waitress with a dark ponytail and a tray of water glasses had been moving between the tables quickly, efficiently, with the focused energy of someone who was very good at a job they had been doing for a long time. She had turned a corner too fast, and a man had stepped backward into her path without looking. A broad, self-important man named Guerrero who ran a shipping operation on the East Docks and was one of the most unpleasant people Marco had ever had the misfortune to share a room with. The water glasses had tilted. 3 of them had emptied directly onto Guerrero's jacket. Guerrero had turned around with the particular fury of a small man who used his money to pretend he was large, and the entire room had gone a little quiet. And the waitress had looked at him, this furious, reddening, important man, and had said, clearly and calmly, and with a small smile that was so perfectly calibrated it could not possibly be taught, "I am so very sorry, sir. Let me get someone to help you with that right away." The smile did not waver. The eyes did not drop. And there was something in them, something in those steady, unbothered eyes, that told anyone paying close enough attention that she was not sorry at all, and that she saw Guerrero for exactly what he was, and that she was handling him with the particular grace of someone who had learned to handle difficult things without breaking. Marco had watched her from across that room for the rest of the evening. He had not spoken to her. He had not approached her. He had not do things like that. But he had not forgotten her face, and now, 6 months later, standing in an empty alley outside a closed pharmacy at 2 in the morning. Her face had been the first thing he recognized, even before he noticed the medicine box in her hand. He would not have admitted this to anyone on earth. But that was the truth. That same night, many miles across the city in a large and very fashionable apartment, a woman named Carol Vega was awake, sitting at her makeup table in a silk robe, scrolling through her phone with sharp, dissatisfied eyes. Carol was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Carefully maintained, deliberately presented, designed to impress. She had dated Marco Reyes for 8 months 2 years ago, and the relationship had ended with a coldness that she had never fully understood or accepted. She told herself it was because Marco was incapable of love. She told herself she had never truly wanted him anyway, that it had been a strategic connection, that she was better off. She told herself these things every single day with such consistency that she had almost started to believe them. And then one of Marco's household staff, a woman Carol still kept in friendly contact with, sent her a small message. Just a few words. Something about Marco stopping his car on Ferndale Road. Something about a girl in a wet jacket. Something about medication being paid for. Carol read the message 3 times. She set her phone down slowly. She picked it up again. She read it a 4th time. Then she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not even a real one. It was the kind of smile that meant the opposite of what smiles are supposed to mean. The kind that meant someone had just decided to go to war. She typed back one message. Find out her name. Lily Santos arrived at Mercy Pharmacy at 3:47 in the morning. She walked in still wearing the enormous black coat over her wet clothes, and she gave her name to the pharmacist at the night counter. And she watched the pharmacist check the screen and then go to the back and come out with a paper bag. Inside the bag were 4 bottles of Rosalind. Not 1, 4, paid in full. And there was a small folded note tucked into the side of the bag, handwritten, 3 lines. It said, "For Rosa, get better soon. M." Lily stood at the counter and read the note. She read it again. She held it in both hands the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. And then, because she had not cried in front of anyone in longer than she could remember, because crying in front of people meant showing them where you could be broken, and she had learned very young that you could not afford to do that, she walked quickly to the corner of the pharmacy near the door where the greeting cards were displayed, and she stood there with her back to the counter, and she cried. Not the sad kind of tears, not the hopeless kind, the other kind. The kind that comes when something you had stopped letting yourself want suddenly appears right in front of you. The kind that means, against everything logic has been telling you, that the world still sometimes does something that makes no sense in the best possible way. She did not know his last name. She did not know what he did for a living. She did not know that the most dangerous men in the city called him by a title instead of a name. She did not know that the very same night, 3 grown men who had tried to test him were sitting in a room somewhere reassessing every decision that had led them to that meeting. She only knew that he had stopped his car, in the rain, for a stranger, and sent medicine for a little girl he had never met. She folded the note carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her own jacket, right over her heart. And she kept it there. 22 days passed. Lily Santos counted them the way people count days when something has happened that they're trying not to think about, by staying busy, by keeping her hands moving, by filling every quiet moment with the next task on the list so that the quiet could not stretch out long enough to hold a thought she was not ready to have. She worked her morning shift at Petal and Stem, the flower shop on Grove Avenue that smelled like roses and fresh water and the particular sweetness of lilies in full bloom. She worked her evening shift cleaning office buildings downtown, pushing a mop cart through long empty corridors under fluorescent lights, listening to audiobooks through one earbud and keeping the other ear free so she could hear if anyone was around. She came home every night at 10:30, checked on Rosa, made sure her medication had been taken, sat on the edge of her little sister's bed until Rosa's breathing went slow and even, and then she went to the kitchen table and worked on the stack of bills that never seemed to get smaller no matter how many she paid. She did not look for the man in the black coat. She did not try to find him. She told herself this was sensible. She told herself that a man who could pay for 4 bottles of medication without blinking and then disappear into a black car like a shadow was not the kind of man whose orbit was safe to enter. She told herself all of this very firmly and convincingly. And then every few nights, when she was half asleep, she would remember the way he had put the coat around her shoulders. Not gently, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, as if it were the only logical thing to do. And she would feel something warm move through her chest as she immediately, firmly redirected toward the ceiling. Marco Reyes was having the opposite problem. He was not a man who ignored things that occupied his mind, because things that occupied your mind without your permission were dangerous. They were a distraction, and distractions in his world had consequences. He knew this. He had spent 15 years making himself into a person who dealt with things directly and then set them aside, clean and complete. And yet, every night for 22 nights, before he could stop himself, he found himself giving Big Paolo a route home that happened to pass a certain block on Crane Street. He told himself the first time that it was not deliberate. The second time he said nothing at all. By the fourth time, Big Paolo had stopped taking the longer route home without being asked, and Marco had said nothing about it. And so the nightly drive past the small apartment building with the orange curtains in the second-floor window had become a thing that simply happened, unnamed and unacknowledged, like a habit that had installed itself without asking permission. He watched the light in the second-floor window. Sometimes it was on when they passed. Sometimes it was already off. When it was on, he stayed quiet longer than usual after they had passed it and turned the corner. Dante Reyes, who was 28 years old, sharper than he pretended to be, and completely incapable of minding his own business, noticed all of this within the first 5 days. He did not say anything immediately. He was impulsive, but he was not foolish. He let it accumulate. He watched his older brother, this stone-faced, unreadable, immovable person who had been everyone's wall for as long as Dante could remember, start checking his phone at odd moments, start coming back from evening drives slightly less tense than when he had left, start pausing sometimes in the middle of conversations as if a thought had moved through him that he was not expecting. Dante collected all of this like evidence, and then he went through Marco's phone. He was not proud of this. He was a little bit proud of this. He found no name in the recent calls except the charge placed to a pharmacy account. Santos, it said, and he found no texts. But there was a note in the memo app that simply said, Petal and Stem. Grove Avenue. Nothing else. No explanation. Dante smiled the smile of a person who has just found the last piece of a puzzle and discovered that the whole picture is exactly as interesting as he hoped it would be. The next morning, Marco walked into the flower shop on Grove Avenue. He had told himself he needed flowers. He had told himself this several times on the drive over, building the justification the way you build a wall, one reasonable brick at a time, until it looks solid enough to stand behind. He needed flowers for the front office, or for, it did not matter. He needed flowers, and this was a flower shop, and there was nothing unusual about any of this. Lily saw him the moment he walked in. She was standing behind the counter, trimming the stems of a bundle of white roses, and she looked up when the bell above the door rang, and then she went completely still. The scissors stayed open in her hand. The rose stems stayed halfway cut. The expression on her face moved through about 7 different emotions in approximately 1 second. Surprise, recognition, something quick and bright that she immediately tried to hide, and then the careful, composed steadiness that she wore the way other people wore armor. She set the scissors down. She did not say hello. She looked at him with those eyes, those direct, unbothered, entirely too perceptive eyes. And she said, "Are you following me?" Marco walked up to the counter. He looked at the roses in the bucket beside her. He looked at the display of sunflowers near the window and the bunches of lavender tied with brown string hanging from the low beam above the counter. He looked at everything in the shop with the focused attention he gave to every room he entered, cataloging and mapping. And then he looked at Lily and said, "I need flowers." "You walked past 17 flower shops to get to this one," Lily said. "Yours had the best roses." She stared at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them blinked for what felt like a very significant amount of time. And then the door at the back of the shop opened, and a small person shot through it at high speed and crossed the entire length of the shop in approximately 4 steps and crashed directly into Marco's legs with a soft thud that would have moved most people backward. Marco did not move backward. He looked down. Rosa Santos looked up. She was 8 years old, and she had her sister's eyes, dark and direct, and full of something that saw more than it was supposed to see. She was wearing a yellow raincoat, even though she was indoors, and she had a small backpack shaped like a turtle on her back. She tilted her head back to look up at the very tall person she had just crashed into, and she studied his face with the completely unfiltered assessment that only very young children and very old people allow themselves. And then she said, with great certainty, as though this were simply a fact she was reporting, "Are you the man who sent my medicine?" Lily cried. She never cries. Something happened in Marco's chest. Something fast and complete and impossible to prepare for. He looked at this small person, this 8-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat who had just walked up to one of the most feared men in Samora and patted his arm like he was a friendly stranger at a bus stop, and he felt the crack in the wall inside him open a little wider. He did not plan what he did next. He just did it. He crouched down, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him folding down to Rosa's level, and he looked at her with an expression that Dante, who had been watching Marco's face for 28 years, would not have recognized. He said very gently, "How are you feeling, little one?" Rosa considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she reached up and patted his cheek twice with a small warm hand and said, "Better. My heart doesn't feel jumpy anymore. Thank you." She paused. Then she added, with the particular generosity of someone who has decided they like you very much, "You can be our friend if you want. We don't have very many, but the ones we have are very good." Marco looked up over Rosa's head at Lily, and Lily's face, the careful, composed, armored face, had come completely apart. She was looking at him the way you look at something you did not expect to be beautiful, standing very still in case moving might make it disappear. She said, quietly, looking at him like she was making a decision she had not planned on making today, "One coffee. That's all." They sat at the small cafe next door at a table, so close to the window that they could see the flower shop through the glass. Marco wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and Lily wrapped both hands around hers, and for a little while neither of them said anything, which was somehow not uncomfortable, which was itself a strange and notable thing. Lily asked him what he did for work. He said he ran a business. She asked what kind. There was a pause, the kind of pause that is not empty but full of decisions being made in real time about how much truth to offer to someone who might not be ready for it. "The complicated kind," he said. She looked at him across the small table. She did not look away. She did not fill the silence with something easier. She just looked at him steadily and then said, carefully and directly, "Are you a bad person, Marco?" He looked at her for a long time, long enough that most people would have looked away. She did not look away. "I have done bad things," he said finally. "I don't know if that is the same." Lily wrapped her hands a little tighter around her cup. She nodded, not the nod of someone agreeing, but the nod of someone receiving information and turning it over to examine it honestly. She did not stand up. She did not change her expression to something cold or alarmed. She just sat with it. And that, of all the things she had done since he had met her, surprised him most. 2 days after the coffee, Dante showed up at Petal and Stem at 9 in the morning, bought every single sunflower in the shop. There were 43 of them, and then turned to face the 5 customers currently browsing and announced with enormous satisfaction, "My brother Marco has liked a girl for the first time in 5 years. Everybody. 5 years. Please join me in celebrating this historic occasion." Lily turned so red that the roses on the counter seemed pale by comparison. Dante leaned across the counter and said in a whisper loud enough for the entire shop to hear, "He drove past your building 11 nights in a row. I counted. He thinks I don't notice things. I notice everything." Then he winked, gathered his 43 sunflowers, and left. Carol Vega had also been doing things. She had found Lily's name within 2 days of the pharmacy night. She had found her address within 4. She had found her work schedule within a week. Carol was efficient when she was motivated, and she was very motivated. She did not think of what she was doing as threatening. She thought of it as protecting an investment, which was how she thought of most things she wanted. She came to the apartment building on Crane Street on a Tuesday afternoon when she had calculated Lily would be at her evening shift. Rosa was home from school early with a slight cold, sitting on the couch watching a nature documentary about penguins, and she answered the door the way 8-year-olds answer doors when no one has told them not to, completely openly, with mild curiosity. Carol crouched down to Rosa's level. She had practiced the smile. It was a good smile, technically. Warm, friendly, the right amount of teeth. She offered Rosa a large bag of candy, expensive candy, the kind in shiny wrappers, and Rosa accepted it with polite interest. "I'm a friend of the man who sent your medicine," Carol said, in the warm voice she used when she needed something. "I just came to check on you. Such a sweet little girl. I'm sure your sister takes wonderful care of you." A pause, precisely timed. "I just worry sometimes about your sister, I mean. The man who sent the medicine, Marco, he isn't always a safe person to be around. His world is very scary. Things happen to people who get close to him." Another pause. "I just think it would be better, safer, for both of you if your sister was a little more careful about who she spends time with. That's all. Just being friendly." Rosa stood in the doorway and listened to all of this with her head slightly tilted, the way birds tilt their heads when they are listening to something they have not decided what to do with yet. She did not say anything while Carol was talking. She accepted the candy. She said thank you politely. She closed the door. When Lily came home at 10:30, Rosa was in bed but not asleep. She looked up at Lily with those dark perceptive eyes and said, without preamble, "A fancy lady came today. She had very expensive shoes, and she smelled like too much perfume, and she brought candy." Lily sat on the edge of the bed slowly. What did she say? Rosa thought about this with great care, organizing the information the way she always organized things, precisely, honestly, without decoration. She said Marco was dangerous and that you should stay away from him. She paused. But Lily, the whole time she was talking, her hands kept touching each other. Like this. Rosa demonstrated, fingers pressing against fingers, a contained, anxious movement. People do that when they're nervous. She was nervous. She was trying to make you scared, but she was already scared herself. Whoever she was, she's afraid of you. Lily looked at her 8-year-old sister for a long moment. "When did you get so smart?" she said. "I've always been this smart," Rosa said with total serenity. "You're just noticing." The warning that came from Iron Valdez was not delivered in words. It was delivered the way warnings in Marco's world were often delivered, quietly through observation, through the slow creep of attention from the wrong direction. One of Marco's people reported that a car had followed Lily home from her evening shift. Not all the way to the door, just far enough to be noticed by someone who knew what they were looking for. Marco was told about it at 11:15 at night, and he sat with the information for exactly 4 minutes, and then he picked up his phone and called Lily. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert in the way night shift workers are alert, tired everywhere except their ears. "I need you and Rosa to come somewhere safe," Marco said. "Tonight." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Marco, what's happening?" "I'll explain everything. But first I need you to pack a bag for you and Rosa. I'm sending cars." Another pause, and then something moved through his voice, something raw and uncovered that he had not planned and could not quite pull back in time. Something that cracked the word open as it came out. "Please, Lily." He had said please to very few people in his adult life, and meant it in that particular way. The way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with the fact that the thought of something happening to her had landed somewhere so central and essential that it had knocked the composure right out of him for just one moment. Lily heard it. She was quiet for 2 more seconds. "Give me 15 minutes, she said. Marco's house was enormous. It sat back from the road behind iron gates and tall hedges. A dark stone building with high ceilings and heavy wooden doors and guards who moved quietly at the edges of things. Every surface was expensive and every room was impeccably maintained, and almost nothing in any of it was soft. It was the house of a man who had built his entire exterior world to match his interior one. Controlled, impressive, armored. Lily stood in the doorway when they arrived and looked at it all. The guards, the gates, the sheer scale of it, the weight of what all of this meant about the man standing in the entrance watching her face. And she said quietly, "This is your world." "Yes," Marco said. "It's very scary." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. Not at the house. At him. At the face that was trying to be unreadable and was not entirely succeeding. At the man who had crouched down to Rose's level in a flower shop. At the man who had put his coat around her shoulders in the rain without asking anything in return. She looked at all of that, the danger and the gentleness existing right next to each other in the same person, and she walked inside. Rosa walked inside 3 steps ahead of her, dropped her turtle backpack by the door, and immediately began exploring at high speed, touching sculptures and asking questions at the rate of approximately one every 7 seconds. Marco followed behind her, 2 feet taller and 40 pounds heavier, the most feared person in the city, patiently explaining what a marble bust was and why the ceiling in the front hallway was painted like the inside of cloud. Dante sat on the upper staircase with his chin in his hands, watching his brother explain cloud ceiling paintings to an 8-year-old, and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt for a very long time. Something that felt like relief, like watching a door open that had been shut for years, letting air into a room that had forgotten what air felt like. He said nothing. For once in his life, he said absolutely nothing. He just smiled. The house on the hill was very different with people in it. Marco noticed this the first morning, when he came downstairs at 6 o'clock as he always did, and found Rosa already in the kitchen, sitting on the counter in her pajamas eating cereal, and having what appeared to be a very serious conversation with the cook about the correct ratio of milk to cereal. The kitchen smelled like toast and coffee and something sweet that the cook had put in the oven, and a morning light was coming through the tall windows at an angle that made everything look warmer than Marco remembered it looking. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite ready to go in, just standing there absorbing the strange and unfamiliar feeling of a house that sounded like somewhere people actually lived. Lily came down 20 minutes later, her hair still damp from the shower, already dressed and practical, carrying a small notebook and looking like she had been awake for a while. She saw Marco at the kitchen island with his coffee, and she sat across from him and poured herself a cup, and they sat in the morning quiet for a few minutes without speaking, which had quickly become something they were both good at, the kind of shared silence that is not awkward, but companionable, the kind that two people only develop when they have stopped performing for each other. Marco had arranged for Rosa to have a tutor come to the house, so she would not fall behind on school while they were staying with him. He had arranged this quietly, the evening after they arrived, without announcing it. Lily had found out about it the next morning when the tutor knocked on the front door at 9 o'clock and Rosa had screamed with delight and dragged the woman to the library. Lily had stood in the hallway for a moment and then walked to find Marco in his study and stood in the doorway and looked at him with an expression he was coming to recognize. The expression of someone who keeps being surprised by a version of him that he has not yet learned to believe in himself. She had not thanked him in words. She had just looked at him for a long moment and then looked away, and the looking was enough. Uncle Felix came to the house on the fourth day. He came the way Uncle Felix went everywhere, slowly, with a cane that he did not need for balance, but simply preferred to have, and with the particular calm of a person who has lived enough life to stop being hurried by any of it. He was a small man with silver hair and a face that had been lived in thoroughly and was much better for it. He ran the soup kitchen on Marlowe Street, where Lily volunteered on her day off, had run it for 15 years, feeding anyone who came through the door, asking nothing and giving everything. Lily had not known until that morning, when Uncle Felix arrived and Marco met him at the door, and the two of them embraced the way people embrace when they have known each other across a very long stretch of time, that the two men were connected. She watched them from the hallway, the old man with the cane and the tall man with the scar, and she felt the world reorganize itself slightly, the way it does when you find out that two completely separate parts of your life have been quietly touching all along without your knowing. Uncle Felix, it emerged over lunch, had known Marco's father, had known the whole Reyes family since before Marco was born, had watched Marco grow from a boy with too much responsibility on his shoulders into a man who had carried it all so long he had forgotten it was possible to set it down. Uncle Felix had kept his distance for years because that was what Marco needed. Someone who would not push, would not crowd, would simply be there when the right moment came. And something about the current situation, Uncle Felix explained to Lily with a warm and measuring look, felt very much like the right moment. It was Uncle Felix who gave Lily the key to everything. He did not mean to. He brought it as a practical thing. A box of old papers from the soup kitchen storage room that he had been meaning to sort through for months. Donation records, mostly. Receipts. Old correspondence. He thought Lily might help him organize it since she was good with paperwork and had time on her hands while she was staying at the house. They spread it all across the large dining room table on the fifth day, and Lily worked through it methodically, sorting and stacking, while Uncle Felix sat at the head of the table drinking tea and telling her stories about the city that were 3 decades old and still somehow fresh. She almost missed it. It was tucked inside a manila folder between 2 sets of donation receipts, paperclipped to a medical document she did not immediately understand. She pulled it out and looked at it again. Her brain processed the words slowly, the way your brain processes things that it is not sure are real, deliberately, cautiously, checking each piece against what it already knew. It was a medication adjustment form. The kind that healthcare providers file when a patient's dosage is being changed. It was dated 2 years and 3 months ago. The patient name at the top was Elena Reyes, Marco's mother. The original prescription was filled in clearly at the top of the form. The dosage that had been approved by her doctor. The safe amount. And below it, in a different handwriting, on a correction line that was supposed to be for doctor-authorized adjustments only, there was a new number. A different number. A number that anyone with even a basic knowledge of cardiac medication would recognize as dangerously, catastrophically wrong. And next to the correction, on the signature line for authorizing medical personnel, was a signature. Carol Vega. Lily sat very still with the paper in her hands for a long time. She was not a medical professional, but she had spent 3 years managing Rose's heart medication, and she knew enough, far more than enough, to understand what she was looking at. She knew that Elena Reyes had died of cardiac complications. She knew, because Dante had told her in one of his unguarded moments, that Marco had blamed himself ever since. That he had convinced himself he had not hired the right doctors, had not pushed hard enough for better treatment, had not done enough. That the guilt of it had become one of the stones he carried around inside him that made him so heavy and so still. She sat with the paper in her hands, and she thought about all of that. And then she thought about Carol Vega, who had come to her door with expensive candy and a smile like a knife wrapped in silk. And she understood, with a cold and horrible clarity, exactly what she was holding. She brought the paper to Dante first, because Dante knew the family history better than anyone, and because she needed someone to confirm that she was understanding it correctly before she took it any further. She found him in the back garden, kicking a ball against the stone wall with his hands in his pockets, doing the thing he did when something was bothering him, but he did not want to say so. She put the paper in his hands. She watched his face as he read it. The ball kicking stopped. Dante's face went through a rapid and terrible sequence of expressions: confusion, comprehension, and then something that landed hard and settled there. A kind of grief mixed with fury, the expression of a person understanding something that changes the shape of the past. He read it twice. He read it a third time. He turned it over as if something on the back might make it make a different kind of sense. Nothing was on the back. "This is real," he said. His voice was different, quieter than usual. All the easy warmth wrung out of it. "I think so," Lily said. Dante was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Lily did not fill the silence. She just waited. "He has blamed himself for 2 years," Dante said finally. Not loudly, just plainly, the way you state a fact that costs you something to say out loud. He thought he didn't do enough. He stopped. He pulled away from everything after she died. Became colder. Harder. "I always thought it was just grief. But it was guilt. He was carrying the guilt of something that wasn't even." He stopped. He pressed one hand flat against the top of the garden wall. "It wasn't even his fault." "I know," Lily said. They stood there together in the late afternoon light, and the garden was very quiet. That night, Lily found Marco in his study. He was sitting in the dark. Not completely dark, a lamp on his desk was on, casting a small, warm circle of light, but everything beyond the desk was in shadow. He was sitting in the chair behind the desk, and on the desk in front of him was a photograph. She had seen it before on the corner of the desk where it always sat, a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes in Marco's mouth, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. Elena Reyes, Marco's mother. He looked up when Lily came in. He looked at her face and then at the paper in her hand, and something in his expression shifted. Not alarm, but attention. The particular quality of attention that a person gives to something their instincts are already telling them they are not ready for. Lily sat down in the chair across the desk from him. She put the paper flat on the desk between them, and she slid it toward him slowly. She said nothing. She just waited. He picked it up. He was a fast reader. She had noticed this about him, the way he processed information quickly and completely, taking it in with a focused efficiency that left nothing unexamined. So it did not take him long. It took him one full read, and then he went very still, and then he read it again, slower this time, and she watched his face, and it was unlike anything she had seen on it before. The stone face, the controlled, impenetrable, nothing gets in face moved. It changed. It moved the way a landscape changes when the earth underneath shifts, not breaking the surface all at once, but rearranging itself, the foundations settling into a new configuration. She killed her, he said. His voice was barely a sound. It was the sound of something very large that had been standing for a very long time, finally reaching the moment where it could not stand anymore. Yes, Lily said. The silence that followed was enormous. It was not empty. It was full of 2 years of guilt dissolving and being replaced by something sharper and more complicated, full of the specific pain of discovering that the story you have been telling yourself about the worst thing that ever happened to you is not the true story at all, that the true story is worse in one way and better in another, and completely different in a third way that you do not yet have words for. I thought, Marco started. Stopped. For 2 years, I thought. I know, Lily said. His head dropped into his hands. The hands, those still, controlled hands that he always kept so perfectly composed, pressed against his face and stayed there. The sound he made was small, barely anything, just the sound of something finally cracking all the way through after holding together for far, far too long. Lily did not say anything wise. She did not offer the kind of words that people offer when they do not know what else to do, the careful, gentle, useless words that circle a wound without ever touching it. She stood up from her chair and she walked around the desk, and she sat down right next to him, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and she put her hand over his on the desk, and she left it there. That was all. That was enough. They stayed like that for a long time. In the morning, Marco called Carol. He did it from his study, standing behind his desk, wearing the expression that he had built over 20 years of very difficult situations, the expression that gave nothing away and promised everything necessary. Carol came to the house at 11 in her best outfit with her best smile already arranged on her face, the particular smile of a person who is planning to negotiate their way back into something they have been removed from. She walked into the study and sat down across the desk from Marco and crossed her legs and settled in with the confidence of someone who is prepared for this conversation very thoroughly. Marco placed a paper on the desk. The smile went away. What followed was quick and ugly and followed a very predictable arc. Carol denied first, smoothly, fluently, with the practiced ease of a person who had been lying for so long they had stopped distinguishing between lies and truths. Then, when denial did not work, she tried alternatives. Maybe someone else had signed her name. Maybe the document was altered. Maybe Lily had found this somewhere and misunderstood it completely. Then, when alternatives did not work, she changed course entirely and went for the attack. On Lily, specifically in the particular vicious way of a person who has run out of every other option. She said things about Lily that were cruel and specific and meant to cut in places where Marco would feel it. She said that Lily was using him, that Lily saw money and safety and had manufactured connection that was not real, that someone like Lily, poor, powerless, from nowhere, could never truly belong in Marco's world, and Marco was too blinded by novelty to see it. Marco listened to all of this without expression. When Carol finished, he stood up slowly from behind the desk. He looked at her the way a closed door looks, not angry, not sad, not conflicted, just final. My mother, he said, used to tell me that you can learn everything important about a person by watching what they do when they think no one is watching. He picked up his phone. He made one call, not to anyone in his organization, to the police, a detective he had a relationship with, a legitimate one, built through legal channels over the past year as part of his slow and deliberate effort to do more things the right way. He said Carol's name. He said what he had. He said he would send the document within the hour. I have done bad things in my life, Marco said when the call was done. I'm not finished accounting for them. But even I understand the difference between what I am and what you are. You killed someone who loved you. You let someone I love carry the weight of it for 2 years. He paused. One beat. I have a line. You crossed a long time ago. Carol was taken from his study by 2 officers 20 minutes later. She walked out with her chin up and her face composed, performing dignity all the way to the door. Dante was in the hallway. He watched her go. He said nothing. Rosa was on the staircase. She absolutely should not have been awake at that hour, and she had a cookie in each hand, and she watched Carol leave with very serious eyes. When the front door closed, she looked at Marco, who had come to stand at the bottom of the stairs. She offered him one of her cookies. He took it. She patted his hand. She went back to bed. In the weeks that followed, Marco did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He sat down with his lawyers, the legitimate ones, the ones he had been slowly building relationships with as part of what he thought of privately as his long project. And he began the process of unwinding the parts of his operation that could not survive daylight. It was not fast. It was not clean. It was the most complicated thing he had ever done, and it involved more risk and more patience and more trust than anything else he had ever attempted. There were people who tested him on it. There were people who tried to use the transition as leverage against him. Iron Valdez made 2 moves in those weeks that had to be handled with the old precision, and Marco handled them, but differently than he would have before, contained, minimal, careful to keep the edges clean. He did not talk about it with Lily directly, but she watched him. She watched the phone calls he took and the ones he did not take. She watched the lawyers come and go. She watched him in the evenings, sitting with papers that were filed in the light instead of conducted in the dark. She was not naive. She did not believe that transformation was simple or that a life built over 20 years could be rebuilt in 20 days. She understood that what he was doing was not complete and might never be completely complete, and that there was real risk woven through all of it. She understood all of that, and she stayed. Uncle Felix found Marco in the garden on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the stone bench where Marco's mother used to sit in the afternoons. The old man sat down beside him without being invited, which was one of the very few things Marco allowed. They sat for a while in the way of people who have known each other across a long time. You look different, Uncle Felix said. I feel different, Marco said. Good different or bad different? Marco thought about this for a long time. Like something I was carrying got put down, he said finally. I keep reaching for it, and it's not there anymore. Uncle Felix nodded slowly. That's what happens when you put something down long enough. You start to think your arms might be for other things. Marco looked at the garden. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table in the morning with her coffee and her notebook. He thought about Rosa sliding down the banister and crashing into him at the bottom, and the way his arms went up to catch her every single time without his brain even having to send the instruction. He thought about a note in a pharmacy bag that said for Rosa, "Get better soon," that a girl had folded and kept over her heart. The question is not whether you love her, Uncle Felix said, without being asked. That's already visible from across a very large room. The question is who you want to be, because the man sitting here right now is not the same man who drove that route 3 years ago or 5 years ago. She didn't make you different. A pause. She just showed you who was already in there, waiting for someone to see it. Marco did not answer, but he sat very still, the way he did when something had landed precisely and completely where it needed to land. Lily was in the garden later that evening, sitting on the low wall where the roses grew along the iron railing, the last light of the day going amber and warm around her. She was not doing anything in particular. She was just sitting, which was something she almost never let herself do, just sit and exist in a moment without the next task already pulling at her. Marco came out through the glass doors. He had something in his hand. He crossed the garden slowly and stood in front of her and held out what he was holding. It was the note, small and folded and a little worn at the crease. For Rosa, get better soon. M. He had found it. She had not known this. Pressed between the pages of the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. He had found it the morning after their coffee, when he had been picking up her jacket to hang it, and it had fallen out. He had stood in the hallway with it for a long moment, and then put it back carefully exactly as he had found it, and had not mentioned it. You kept it, he said. It was the first time someone helped me when they didn't have to, Lily said, looking at it in her own hands now. I keep things that feel like that. Evidence that the world is better than it usually lets on. Marco was quiet for a moment. He looked at the roses along the wall, and then at her face, and then somewhere in the middle distance where a person looks when they're trying to find words for something they have never tried to say out loud before. I spent 5 years turning myself into someone that nothing could get through, he said. I was very good at it. I made the walls so high that I eventually stopped being able to see over them myself. After my mother, after Carol, I decided that wanting things from people was the most dangerous thing I could do. That it just gave them a place to hurt you. He paused. And then you were standing in the rain in an alley reading medicine labels, and you looked up at me like you were not afraid of anything in the world. Not me. Not the dark. Not any of it. And something got through anyway. Through every wall. All of them. Like they were never even there. Lily looked at him. I'm not a simple life, he said. I know that. There's still so much I'm trying to fix, and some of it I may never get right. And it would be completely reasonable for you to decide that all of that is too much. I would understand that. I would understand that better than anything else you could decide. He met her eyes, held them. But I am asking you not to. I am asking you to let me keep trying, if you will stay close enough to watch. Lily looked at him for a long time. Long enough to see all of it. The danger and the gentleness, the damage and the effort. The man who had crouched down to an 8-year-old's level in a flower shop, and the man who had faced down 3 rivals in a conference room without raising his voice. The man who drove past her building 11 nights in a row, and the man who had finally stopped the car. You already started, she said. The night you stopped the car. She handed the note back to him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket, right over his heart, where she had kept it. And the garden was warm and golden and very quiet. Rosa graduated from her tutor's reading program 6 weeks later and celebrated by demanding a party with exactly 3 guests, Lily, Marco, and Dante, and an unreasonable quantity of the fancy cookies from the kitchen. Dante arrived with balloons. Marco arrived with the cookies. Lily arrived with a small wrapped gift, a new book, the kind with a story in it that went on and had no end in sight. Rosa accepted all of it like it was her absolute right, which it was. The house on the hill filled up slowly, not with things but with sounds. Rosa asking questions at full speed. Dante arriving unannounced and being impossible to remove. Uncle Felix coming on Tuesdays with old stories and tea. Lily at the kitchen table in the mornings with her notebook and her coffee, quiet and present and entirely herself. Marco stood in the doorway of the kitchen on a morning 3 months later and watched all of it. The ordinary, unremarkable, entirely extraordinary fact of his house being alive, and he felt the walls in his chest, which he had spent so many years building, simply no longer be there. Not broken down dramatically, just gone, dissolved, replaced by something that had no weight at all. He went in and poured himself a coffee and sat at the table across from Lily and did not say anything. She looked up from her notebook. She looked at his face. She saw what was there. She looked back down at her notebook. She smiled, and it was enough. It was everything. It was exactly, precisely, perfectly enough. The bravest thing you can do is let yourself be seen by the right person at the right time in the right rain. One last thing before you go. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath during Marco's quiet moments, or smiling at Rosa in her yellow raincoat, or feeling Lily's exhausted and stubborn kind of hope like it was something you recognized, then you already know what great storytelling can do. Stories like this live and grow when people share them. If you read this all the way to the end, that means something. Pass it on to someone who needs a reminder that people can change, that love does not always arrive looking the way you expected, and that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is one person deciding to stop the car. Share this story. Save it. Come back to it on a hard day. And if you have a story of your own, one with walls and rain and a moment where something got through anyway, consider telling it. The world needs more of those. Thank you for reading every single word.